All right, well, we don't want to let it go, I think, too long. So in order to give Professor Wiley all of her allotted time, I'll give a very short and sweet introduction. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Wiley for a talk that is co-hosted by the Graduate Program in Historic Preservation and the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites here at the Weitzman School of Design. At least I'm near campus, if not on campus. As many of you probably know, Amber Wiley is a very well regarded and well-known scholar of African-American architectural history and landscape history. She is an assistant professor of art history at Rutgers, has written some fantastic articles and is working on a book, and has been involved in some really important professional projects as well in Washington, DC, NHL nominations and other kinds of testimony. So an incredibly well-accomplished scholar, practitioner, writer, professor, and we are just very grateful that you could spend this time with us telling us about your latest work. And I invite all of you to add your questions into the chat as we go along. And after the talk, Professor Matero will be moderating the Q&A, and I'll just say that personally, I'm really looking forward to hearing you and turning a fresh page in my notebook. And Amber, thanks again for joining us.
All right, well, thank you all for having me. Thanks, Randy and Frank, for reaching out and offering up this opportunity to speak to you all about this research that came out of several projects that I've been working on. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. All right. Thanks also to the Graduate Program in Historic Preservation and the Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites at the University of Pennsylvania, Weitzman School of Design. So this research re-examines the legacy and the important work of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, also known as ABC, in Washington, DC, and throughout the nation. This research illustrates how the ABC set the precedent for a more nuanced understanding of the American past, expanding the National Park Service's inclusion of Black historic landmarks 20-fold. The final project, which I'm hopefully going to be starting in the spring, in the fall, will be a monograph detailing the longtime collaboration between the organization and the National Park Service, which continued when the ABC reorganized as the Afro-American Institute for Historic Preservation and Community Development. What I think is really interesting is that community development piece. They were really interested in doing work that helped revitalize African-American neighborhoods across the US and thinking about ways to bring life, breathe life into these particular sites and districts. So what I'm going to do, in addition to starting my stopwatch, is to read a little bit of a quote from you all while we're still here on this title page. And it's from Vincent DeForest, one of the founders of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. So just close your eyes and imagine. Why should a couple of Black Americans who claim no lineage with the first families of colonial America, who clearly are no showmen, and who have no money that allows them to pursue an interest in the bicentennial at their leisure and as a sideline, why should we have such a great concern for the bicentennial? Why should we be so presumptuous as to form a nonprofit corporation, the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, just to promote bicentennial ideas, projects, and programs? Perhaps it is because we have experienced the spirit of the revolution in our own lives. We know that it is a continuing thing, and we believe much of the leadership for continuing the American Revolution in recent decades has come from Black Americans. What is this continuing revolution we seek to promote in America? We believe it is an ongoing process of decolonization. In the words of the noted historian Richard B. Morris, we believe it is a movement towards self-realization and self-government by, quote, people determined not to be kept in a subject status. And this was testimony of Vincent DeForest on behalf of the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation in 1972, right? So, you know, in today's current political climate, you hear a lot of discussion about decolonization, your curriculum, decolonizing preservation, decolonizing this and that, but we should know that there is a much longer history with this kind of focus. And, you know, we can look all the way back to the 1970s when we're having folks expanding Black studies programs and ethnic study programs. You know, there is a long history to this. And a lot of folks today are reinventing the wheel. They need to look back and see this longer history of attempting to decolonize our practice, as it were. My interest in this particular topic spurs from my work with the National Park System Advisory Board, National Historic Landmarks Committee. I love saying that because it's so long and ridiculous. But it's a subcommittee of the National Park System's Advisory Board, the larger advisory board. And the National Historic Landmarks Committee generally looks at and reviews National Historic Landmark nominations that have made it through a strenuous process with the SHPOs to be considered for this, you know, top honor of a National Historic Landmark. I served on this committee from 2014 to 2018. I will say that the last part of my time on the Landmarks Committee was kind of a purgatory, so to speak. We never did meet in official capacity for the last 2 years on the job because of a longer, or I should say a larger administrative issue in which the National Park Service was just really spinning its wheels. And the people on the larger advisory board were trying to meet with the Secretary of the Interior and they were denied. You might have remembered the kind of stir up from that when the majority of the folks from the National Park System Advisory Board stepped down from their positions, right? That might ring a little bell. So the first 2 years of the work on the Landmarks Committee was absolutely invigorating. We were engaged with a couple of projects and workshops called Multiple Voices. I actually see folks who were in those workshops on the call. And the idea was to ask the question, well, how do we create a more inclusive National Historic Landmark program? And we looked at specific case studies to think about the kind of difficulties that arose when we were looking at what the National Park System considered controversial case studies. My second interest in this particular topic, looking at the work of ABC and the DeForest brothers more generally, stems from my involvement with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, also known as Osawa. It was founded by Carter G. Woodson as the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, right? I was a co-principal investigator with Dr. Maria McCurder for the update of the National Historic Landmark nomination for the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site. And the original National Historic Landmark nomination was completed by ABC in 1976 for the bicentennial. And the Woodson site later became a National Historic Site in a unit of the park system. Maria and I were in consultation with Barbara Dunn, Dr. Betty Gardner, and Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who were instrumental in securing a grant that helped us do this longer research. And it lasted from 2018 to 2020. And those folks, I see some of them on the call, so shout outs to you all as well. In the process of updating this nomination, I began to document the history of ABC, as well as their later iteration as the Afro-American Institute for Historic Preservation and Community Development. My final kind of connection to this work came through a Monument Lab artistic residency for Revolution in J, which I participated in over the course of the summer and fall of 2020. This particular initiative looked at sites related to the American Revolution in the state of New Jersey. I focused on 2 sites, the original location of the Indian Queen Tavern, also known as the Bell Hotel, which you see here in New Brunswick, as well as its relocated new site at the East Jersey Old Town Village, which is a museum village, or a village museum, I should say. And so I was looking particularly at the history of that site as it related to the 1976 bicentennial in New Jersey. And so this idea of looking at the bicentennial as a way into understanding how we remember American history was really important for me. So now to think about the work that ABC did, there were two key pieces of legislation that framed this particular story that I'm going to show you all. The first was the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission, which was signed into law on January 4th, 1966. I mean, July 4th. Hello, July, as an Independence Day. As well as the National Preservation Act that created the National Register of Historic Places, the modern day iteration of our state preservation, the state preservation historic offices, as well as the modern day version of the National Historic Landmark Program. There were national monuments and national sites that were dedicated according to the 1935 Historic Sites Act, but the legislation in 1966 expanded the program so that, you know, we could form what is now known as the National Historic Landmarks Program. So one of the major critiques of the ARBC Commission was that it was primarily focused on the celebration of achievements with a specific Eurocentric focus, a first family lens, think the Mayflower. On the other end of the spectrum, community activists of historically oppressed groups saw this moment of the bicentennial as an opportunity to highlight their contribution to the country's history, thereby including a more inclusive notion of nationhood. So these two impulses, one of contraction, looking specifically at, you know, first families of the colonial period, and then one of expansion, reveal the deep historical reckoning that was taking place in the 1970s. One of the greatest articles that I found while doing this research came from the Ebony August 1975 issue, where they're looking at the bicentennial and asking the questions, should Blacks celebrate the bicentennial, right? And then they offered up three different views. One was no, one was a qualified maybe, and one was an absolute yes. And here we have an image of the recently deceased Vernon E. Jordan offering us a qualified maybe. And so Atlanta businessman and activist, and at the time he was the head of the National Urban League, said, you know, opting out of the bicentennial would close us to the opportunity to use it for our own ends. Just joining the party would result in missing opportunities and, quote, and this is a real emphasis, degrading our past by accepting other people's myths, right? So he's like, yes, we should absolutely try to be a part of it, but we can't just join the party, right? Like your involvement, if you are to be involved with the bicentennial celebration, should be one that includes highlighting our own Black American history. So he's like, yes, but, so a qualified maybe. And so I'm looking specifically at the work of folks who said, you know, an absolute yes, and who were looking specifically to highlight this Black history. So the DeForest brothers, and this is from a Washington Post 1989 article, were two brothers who were originally from Ohio, and they made their way to Washington, D.C. Robert DeForest, actually spelled with two R's, and Vincent DeForest, spelled with one R, wanted to address the ARBC's lack of representation and engagement with African Americans. So Robert DeForest moved to Washington in 1967 after serving in the Army. He then worked in public health and with a variety of other community organizations. Vincent DeForest was also an Army veteran, or is also an Army veteran. Vincent is still with us. Robert passed away in 2007. He is an Army veteran as well as an architect who had worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and as well as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, participating in the Poor People's Campaign, Resurrection City in 1968. So here we see an image of Resurrection City. Vincent, the brothers' civil rights activism was tied to a larger trend in Washington, where Black advocates in the city prior to home rule honed their collective bargaining skills on a national level. And here is a quote from Vincent, who talked about the fact that, Martin Luther King's death released a kind of activism that he had not seen before, and everyone was willing to contribute something to the Poor People's Campaign. This is actually an image of a part of a wall that he was involved in creating that is now in the collection of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. So Robert and Vincent co-founded the Afro-American Bicentennial in 1970, and this is a great article I found in JET. So yeah, they're making national news here. The ABC's mission was to increase participation of African Americans in the bicentennial, to direct projects that highlighted Black history, but most importantly, to be a vehicle for improving the lives of Black Americans. So on the one hand, it wasn't just about Black history, but about, Black livelihood in the 1970s and what that looked like, and thinking about it and including this within this larger narrative of a revolution. So the brothers worked to continue the revolution through the process of decolonization, also a movement towards self-realization and self-government by the people, determined not to be kept in subject status, like I said before. In this way, ABC was an outgrowth of the home rule movement in Washington, as well as the civil rights and Black power movements, right? So this is historic preservation with a distinct civil rights and Black power tint to it, with a distinct home rule for DC tint to it, right? It's not just about preservation for the sake of preservation's sake. And so this is an image of Robert DeForest talking in front of Cedar Hill, the home of Frederick Douglass, in 1970 while it was undergoing rehabilitation by the Park Service. And we see Vincent here also in the back. So the ABC's work was multifaceted, but the main arm of their initiative started in 1971 when they entered into a contract with the National Park Service to conduct a survey of historic sites for potential designation as National Historic Landmarks. At the time, the NPS had 1,200 National Historic Landmarks, with only 3 directly and clearly celebrating Black history. Those were the homes of George Washington Carver, seen on the top, in Missouri. The National Monument was founded in 1943 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he dedicated $30,000 to this monument, which is actually about, at this point, 240 acres of the sites of Carver's enslavers, their home, as well as a partial reconstruction of the slave dwelling where George Washington Carver lived. The Booker T. Washington boyhood home was funded by a $50 coin that was created with his likeness of it, and that became a national monument in 1956. And as well as the Frederick Douglass home, which became a unit of the Park Service in 1962. In addition to the fact that the ABC was contracted to work with the NPS, there were no professional staff within the Historic Sites Survey, within the National Register of Historic Places, or the National Historic Landmarks Program. No Black professional staff in any of those programs whatsoever. So the ABC contracted out their work to researchers sourced through Osawa and Black architects across the country to survey, document, and develop historic site survey data, as well as National Historic Landmark nominations for the sites across the country related to the Black struggle. This is not to say that there were no Black preservationists, nor that Black Americans did not care for sites of historic significance. The Douglass home, for instance, was taken care of for decades by the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So we see that here, right? So prior to its NPS unit, prior to its inclusion as an NPS park unit, Black women were preserving the home and legacy of Frederick Douglass. Additionally, in 1937, Carter G. Woodson noted that in consultation, in collaboration with the Negro History Week celebration, that pilgrimages to monuments consisted of another important feature of this celebration. This is 1937. Such interest has been manifested in all celebrations of Negro History Week, but it was more pronounced this year than ever, probably because of a growing appreciation of the characters in history memorialized in the sacredness of the ground on which they labored for humanity. And so he talks about people frequenting the Frederick Douglass home, the scenes of the labors of Booker T. Washington and Tuskegee, the birthplace of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the Sojourner Truth House, and the Harriet Tubman Shrine, and the tomb of Paul Cuffey, right? And he says, these are monuments, not the least imposing, but great because they are enshrined in the hearts of the descendants of those generations that these heroes served. So already in the early, in 1937, we're seeing Carter G. Woodson talking about the work of Negro History Week in its 12th year, but also about the fact that there are Black folks who are making pilgrimages to these sites, not because they're grand and imposing and have the highest, integrity and the most fabulous architecture that you've ever seen, but because they're great and are enshrined in the hearts of the descendants of those generations that these heroes served, right? So we're already understanding that Black preservation and the idea of sacred historic sites is something that's been happening before the work of the DeForest brothers, but they're the ones who are bringing it into an institutionalized situation with the Park Service. So to that end, the DeForest brothers brought in historians Charles H. Wesley on the left. So I'm going from left to right and to top to bottom. Charles H. Wesley, who was the executive director of the Association for the Study of what was in the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which had been founded by Carter G. Woodson. They brought in Representatives Ron Dellums and Shirley Chisolm, Osawa president Edgar A. Toppin, Letitia Woods Brown, John Blessingame, Benjamin Quarles, Mary Frances Berry, Senator Edmund Muskie, and Dorothy Porter. These were just a few of the power players that were on ABC's advisory board, as well as historians who they looked to help them with the research projects and the surveys that they conducted. This is a powerhouse of intellectual capital here. Toppin also became the first Black person to serve on the NPS advisory board in 1975, while Porter became the first Black person to serve on the Historic Sites Survey Committee, right? So what we're seeing is the DeForest brothers through ABC bringing this Black intellectual capital to the Park Service with the contracts that they've secured, but also these folks who are then the first, right? The first on the advisory board, the first in the Historic Site Survey Committee, all of these things. In fact, it would be this intellectual and political power, as well as the radical dedication to the project, that NPS employees would later recount as intimidating. So I'm going to show you all a next slide about some of the other folks who were involved with the program. But the fact of the matter is they brought in this intellectual capital. And here I have a few covers of just a sampling of the research that these scholars did, right? Freed Negroes of the District of Columbia, the Negro in the American Revolution, Black Resistance, White Law, the slave community, plantation life, the collapse of the Confederacy, the betrayal of the Negro. They also had Rayford Logan as one of the historians they consulted. These were folks who held administrative positions in historically Black colleges and universities. These are folks who had taught in the history departments of these institutions and others, including some in New England as well. Like, this was the heart of Black intellectual prowess at the time. And I actually jumped ahead. So this intellectual and political power would be part of what was considered the intimidation of the national park system, there's actually a history, two histories that speak to the ways in which National Park Service members were a little bit reluctant and hesitant to push back against the work that the DeForest were doing because they felt intimidated by the political power which the DeForest brothers had. On the other hand, you will hear some oral histories talking about the fact that they loved the political power and the publicity that the brothers brought to the National Park Service. So you see here Senator Ed Brooke and Congressman Walter Fauntroy. Ed Brooke also served on the advisory board for the ABC, for the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation. And Walter Fauntroy then was the first representative from the District of Columbia after they gained home rule. And so Vincent DeForest kind of debriefing with these two major figures in Congress. I should also say that the Black Congressional Caucus was another place where the DeForest brothers reached out to in order to elicit support for their work for these National Historic Landmarks. The ABC conducted a study entitled Beyond the Fireworks, which suggested NHL nominations under 3 broad themes. And so this is the moment where we're thinking about the creation of themes in which to include certain sites within the National Historic Landmark Program. So the first was the development of English colonies, 1700 to 1775, the political and military affairs within the country, as well as society and social conscience. Those were the 3 main themes under which the DeForest brothers worked. So these themes emphasize the early African-American contributions to the founding of the United States, African-American sacrifice during times of war, and the social movements that laid the groundwork for the civil rights activism of the day. The organization was successful in nominating 61 landmarks and districts to the National Park Service by the end of its initial contract. So we see this 1974, 3 years of work by the ABC. This included the homes of Harriet Tubman, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Carter G. Woodson, as well as neighborhoods and institutions like Boley, Oklahoma, and the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Right, and so this article actually talks about the fact that there were few and far in between Black landmarks within the Park Service. I'm actually going to take a moment to pull up a map that I created of various National Historic Landmark nominations that ABC created and mapping them onto the US here. So what we see is the number of, and it was 69 nominations that I was actually able to find in the archives. Not all of these became National Historic Landmarks, but the vast majority of them did. This work was expansive. It even went west of the Mississippi, right? James Weldon Johnson residence, the Charlotte Fortin Grimke House, the Oliver Otis Howard House, the Anthony Bowen branch of YMCA. DC folks were like, I know all these sites, right? The Henry Osawa Tanner home, Mount Zion and Female Union Cemetery, the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site. Like we have, I'm just scrolling through so you can see the breadth of the sites that they worked on and researched and submitted to the National Park Service. And you might be thinking, wow, this is like all the Black National Historic Landmarks I know. Yes, the vast majority of them came from this work. Okay. All right, so interestingly enough, approximately 47 sites were included in Washington, D.C., including Howard University, Woodlawn Cemetery, and Deanwood. I mapped up a number of the sites that were specific to DC. I also mapped a number of sites that were specific to the Shaw Urban Renewal area. If folks heard my talk last week, you heard me talk about Shameful Shaw. And this was actually coming out of research I did for my first manuscript book. And I just was kind of astounded. And, one of the things that Vincent DeForest said was that Shaw has more historically Black sites than any other community of its size in the country, right? And if we're thinking about Black political, social, intellectual, capital and historic sites, then yeah, Washington, D.C. would make sense. And this particular area just south of Howard University, the Black Broadway, U Street, 7th Street, all of these things, right? All of the sites that they recommended for the Shaw Urban Area Renewal weren't accepted as National Historic Landmarks, but they did give us a kind of sense of the breadth of the work that could be seen even in DC. Shaw was important because it was at the heart of the uprising in 1968 as a result of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So you see here a map from the National Capital Planning Commission of the damage that was sustained in these uprisings, as well as, kind of understanding the centrality of this neighborhood in Washington, D.C. to that particular point. And I love the fact that ABC is like, well, we still have these significant historic sites that we need to protect in this area. I want to make clear too that the Shaw neighborhood and an urban renewal project that was being proposed for this particular neighborhood was not the kind of urban renewal that we had seen before, but was one that was directed by Walter Fauntroy, who we saw in that previous image, right? Before he was actually a representative. And he desired that this urban renewal would be with the people, for the people, by the people, right? And so if you think about it, you have folks like Fauntroy who are desirous of rebuilding the neighborhood for Black Americans. And then you have folks like the DeForest brothers who are coming in and landmarking historic sites of significance in there, right? It's like this protection, this layer of protection that Black neighborhoods had not seen prior to this time period. I actually took some time to compare the landmarks that were proposed by ABC in Washington, D.C. with those that were proposed by the Joint Committee on Landmarks, which was the predecessor to the Historic Preservation Office in Washington. This is something that they concocted in 1973 that designated the landmarks of the District of Columbia. They had 3 different categories, and this was a result of that 1966 legislation that I mentioned before. First were landmarks of great importance, which contribute significantly to the national cultural heritage of that of Washington, D.C. and its environs. Landmarks of importance which contribute significantly to the cultural heritage or the visual beauty of D.C., which could possibly be restored if possible, right? Category 1 must be preserved. Category 2 possibly be preserved. Category 3, which should be preserved if practical, right? Must be, possibly, if practical. And so I zoomed in on the Shaw urban renewal area, and I was kind of astounded by the lack of landmarks that were actually identified by the Joint Committee on Landmarks. I actually see someone shaking their head like, you shouldn't be astounded that there's a lack. Right, so that we see DuPont Circle. One that actually was applicable were the vistas of the Lafayette Plan. They wanted to preserve the vistas and the streets and the parks, and Shaw included that, as you see right here. They included Logan Circle, Howard Theater, preserve if practical, included various churches within the district, one house, and a market, right? But none of the types of landmarks that we saw that were being proposed by the DeForest brothers. And one of the reasons that it was really important to think about what the what the historic significance of DC was is because of this oncoming bicentennial. So I have this image of the front of a brochure from the city planning commission within Washington, D.C., and they're thinking about DC moving forward from 1968 uprising to the bicentennial. That's only 8 years of work to be done, right? If you think about the ways in which DC was kind of devastated, they were really looking towards the bicentennial as a way to bring in tourists and to show the progress that has happened and occurred in the city. So I pulled up one of the official bicentennial maps to see if any of the sites of our good friends, the DeForest brothers, made it onto the main stage. Surprise none of you all that there's nothing there except for Dunbar High School. Yeah, that's it. And then we see here this large concentration of the historic sites within the National Mall in the downtown area, right? So this idea that once you leave the National Mall in downtown, there's nothing to see. Well, of course, the DeForest brothers were intent on changing that narrative. So just a few of the sites that they were able to preserve as National Historic Landmarks in DC: the Carter G. Woodson home, the Mary Church Terrell home, the Blanche K. Bruce home, the Charlotte Fortin Grimke House, General Oliver Otis Howard House, Anthony Bowen Branch YMCA, like I said, Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society cemeteries, the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. They included this as part of their work. Mary Ann Shadd Carey House, the LaJoy Park Historic District, Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church, and you all know I can't go on, right? I can go on. This is just a sampling. What I also found interest specifically in the work of ABC within DC is that the current day historic districts overlap with Shaw. And I just think about how much of this history that we now value was seen by the DeForest brothers, right? They're absolutely far ahead of their time. If you're comparing 1976 to the 2010s, right? This particular map came out in 2018. And so we have the greater 14th Street Historic District, the greater U Street District, the Blagden Alley and Naylor Court Historic District, the Shaw Historic District, right? So all of these districts encompassing a variety of sites that are part of the district that make it what it is. And it's the same pieces of the puzzle that the DeForest brothers were working on in the 1970s. So what is really the main issue for the sites that were preserved in DC, for instance, and sites across the country is the issue of gentrification and displacement, which challenge this notion of preservation on a holistic standpoint. What the DeForest brothers were working for was for, enlivening, enriching, and improving the lives of African Americans across the country. Part of what they did, and this is not even the whole of what they did, but part of what they did was to include these National Historic Landmarks in the districts as layers of protection for this great history of African Americans in the country. What we're seeing now, and anyone who knows DC knows, like Shaw is a hot spot for gentrification. And then it's just a kind of, spotty understanding of the history at best, which is absolutely not what the DeForest brothers were working towards. So ABC's partnership with the National Park Service lasted decades after the bicentennial. They reorganized as the Afro-American Institute, and they set the framework for multiple property and thematic studies that are used today to contextualize sites representing the contribution of women, members of the Latinx and LGBTQ communities, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders for heritage preservation, right? The types of studies that they conducted for African American history set the standard here. Moreover, the work of the ABC came at a time when Black communities fell victim to urban renewal, highway construction, civil unrest, and local and national disinvestment. So that landmarking the sites and districts affiliated with Black history created a layer of federal protection previously not afforded to Black communities and guaranteed documentation by the Historic American Building Survey, So the historical record of these structures would be in the public domain for perpetuity, reversing the pattern of systemic destruction and erasure of Black communities in the US. Right here, I have just a few of the various sites that ABC nominated as NHLs across the country. Top left, we have Villa Lawaro, Martin Luther King birthplace. On the right, we have the Maggie L. Walker National Historic Site in Richmond. So that's New York, Atlanta, Richmond, the Harriet Tubman site in upstate New York, the Mary McLeod Bethune House in Washington, D.C., and even, and this is the interior, and I love this, the Taft Baum House, the Taft Museum of Art in Ohio, in Cincinnati, which was actually nominated as an NHL for the murals done by Robert Duncanson on the interior, right? An early Black landscape painter. So it's just this vast array of sites that came into the Landmarks program through ABC's work. So part of what I want to do moving forward, because this is a talk about work in progress, right? Is to document the condition of all of the NHLs that the Afro-American Bicentennial and the Afro-American Institute nominated for inclusion in the National Historic Landmarks program. I'm a native of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Washington, D.C. is my second home, which is why, you know, you see me with the concentration on D.C., particularly African-American and historic structure studies. But Boley, Oklahoma was one of the districts that was nominated under the work of ABC. It's one of the oldest all-Black towns in the state of Oklahoma. It has the oldest continuing rodeo, Black rodeo in the country, one that I've attended before in the past. And so these are actually images of Boley in 1974 when it was being documented through the work of ABC, and Boley from a 2016 Google Map Street View that I grabbed just recently, right? So we're seeing the continued loss of structures here. The one in the front is the T.M. Haynes building, which was built in 1909, and it's considered a contributing structure to the historic district. And it's just the kind of interest that I have in the work of this particular organization that is kind of leading me to think about the long history of restoration, renovation, or decline that has happened in some of the areas that they documented. Another site that they documented as a National Historic Landmark was the New York Amsterdam News building. You actually see it in 1979 right here with a beauty shop on the bottom. Today, 40 years later, looking fairly the same, but I was actually trying to find any kind of plaque, and we know that the plaque is like not the be all and end all. It's actually this building here, if you're looking for it. The New York Amsterdam News actually had multiple sites and multiple buildings. And so this is not the last one that they occupied, but it's just a kind of survey that I'm interested in doing of the sites that the organization documented. Here's another one, 1980 view on the left in 2019. This is the Henry Osawa Tanner House in Philadelphia. So if we're thinking about the places that these brothers documented, along with the work of these great historians, politicians, activists, you know, they're all across the country and all in various states of existence. Not all of the NHLs became, you know, museums or public sites. Some of them are still privately owned. And so part of what my research in the future is going to be is to see exactly which states are, or which sites are in a state of disrepair, which ones are still, which ones have been revigorated, and asking the question why. You know, what's the difference between what has happened and how can National Historic Landmark designation make or break in some ways the life of these particular sites. And so one way to think about this is that we are 5 years out from 2026, when the country will reflect again on the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the beginning of the American Revolution. Today, as we observe our country's numerous political, social, and cultural divisions, we should also revisit again what it means to be American, who controls our story, who is included in the narrative, and what metrics are used to perpetuate exclusionary practices in preservation research and practice. So, one of the things that I found while doing this research on ABC is that the issue of integrity, which has come up time and again when we're looking at various sites of folks who were not necessarily the most rich, right, kind of materially deprived communities, came up even in the 1970s. And I think one of the things that I found interesting is the ways that they fought against this notion of a high degree of integrity, specifically for African-American sites. That's not saying that they're trying to lower the standard, which has been one of the arguments when you're shifting around this notion of integrity. But I actually found a quote from Vincent DeForest, and I was like, oh, I'm kind of conflicted about this as someone who was trained in the manner of architectural history and historic preservation that you can get at any of your predominantly white architecture institutions. DeForest talks about this notion of reconstruction, right? And when we think about reconstruction and preservation, that is like the big bad wolf, don't want to talk about it. Preservation purists hate it. And I have learned to kind of hate it too, right? But then I got this quote from Vincent DeForest, and I was like, I kind of understand what you're saying here. And this is from 1974 from the Beyond the Fireworks document, where he says that reconstruction of many Afro-American sites is essential because of the historic deprivations of Afro-Americans, which have severely limited their accumulation of property. The threat of urban renewal, against much of which, despite the odds, they have been able to attain, and the aesthetic biases of Anglo-American architectural historians who view these remains. Reconstruction is the only way that some very important Afro-Americans can have their sites for commemoration. And there are too many important Afro-Americans whose lives and works are significant to the history of this country for them to be forgotten simply because their homes or places of business are now gone. And so I think about this notion. I mean, here we are in 2021, we still kind of cringe at the idea of reconstruction, and I'm fine with that. But I also wonder about the myriad of ways that we can pay homage to, signify, document, and preserve these sites, maybe beyond reconstruction, right? The Monument Lab work has been really fundamental with that. So thinking about public art projects, public education within the school system, the kinds of work that the Center for Civil Rights Sites is doing right now and proposing to do in the future. So I'll take away this notion of reconstruction and really put it into this commemoration on a larger scale in a variety of means. Because one thing remains kind of steadfast is the notion of the lack of material wealth and the use of the federal government to actually, destroy these homes and these sites is well documented. And so thinking about that and the kind of structures of the historic preservation programs that we see, including the National Historic Landmark program, we really need to come to terms with what we're dealing here, with what we are dealing with here. And so I'd like us to just think about this revolution that the DeForest brothers proposed in the 1970s of continuing this revolution of decolonization, and one that is meant to improve the lives of African Americans across the country, and take up that banner and run with it into 2022, run with it into 2026, and run with it. They were immensely imaginative, immensely knowledgeable, and it's still really kind of devastating that the work they have done has heretofore not really been studied in an in-depth manner, but then also historic preservation and National Historic Landmark Program histories have kind of painted them in a light as folks who came from the outside and didn't know what they were doing, right? Understanding that the intellectual capital that ABC brought to the Park Service is part and parcel of the reason why we have some of the most outstanding Black National Historic Landmarks that we do. So I'll just, I'll just step off my soapbox there. Thank you for your time, and thank you for this opportunity to present the work of the DeForest brothers to you, specifically as it is, really fundamental to our notion of what it means to preserve civil rights sites.
Okay, Amber, thank you so much for that. If we could have you stop sharing screen. I can see all the names and some faces. I just want to say, while it's fresh on my mind, you have an invitation to come back next spring when we will be hosting an international symposium on Reconstruction, ? And I would just offer. I'm glad you're willing to reconsider Reconstruction as a viable form of preservation. I would say, with respect to what you've talked about, it is probably one of the best forms of reparation that is political and tangible. And so, I think one could make a really good case. So save the date, and I'll be in touch. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that too. Reconstruction ? I think that's really important.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So I can see the chat is quickly filling up. I'm going to ask Sarah Leonard to help me on this. So we'll start with the chat, and I think if you just would put your questions in there, we'll try to get as many as possible within the time that we have. So to give us some semblance of being in place and real, I will read these, okay? And Amber, feel free to answer or say next, and I could go on. Okay, first one, and I'll take these in order if I can. And I think we actually saw a reference to this already. In your work documenting the work of the ABC, did you ever come across restoration plans for the Mount Zion Female Union Band Cemetery?
Thank you for that question, Doug. Full-on plans for the restoration I haven't come across, but I do know that they were working specifically with that site to oppose development on it, right? Development and taking of that site in Georgetown, which was, a high property real estate. There was a Washington Post article just recently in 2018 that talked about continuing work and the dangers of that site, specifically the lack of restoration. When ABC was doing the research and attempting to protect that site, they had student volunteers coming to, remove debris, all sorts of things. But I'm not fully certain on the reasons why full restoration didn't happen. So that's absolutely something that's central, that's extremely central to their work in DC, and something I look forward to looking into in the future. But I appreciate that.
Okay. Amber, do you have and can you share any insight into what the brothers thought of the NPS? What the unvarnished truth?
Hello, Ray. Thank you. That's a great question. I actually know that there are some folks on the call who might be able to answer it better than I can, because I haven't yet had access to their private archives. Vincent DeForest has an extensive archive about this particular work. And so what I've generally been able to find that's on record and open on the interwebs is the NPS's thoughts about the Forest brothers, right? Not vice versa. But with conversations and email with Vincent, it seems like there's a lot of corrective history that needs to happen because their work, their impact has been downplayed. The fact of the matter is that they're bringing to the National Park Service subject matter experts. They're bringing to the National Park Service folks who'd be able to sit on these boards and committees that never had Black Americans on the boards and committees. There was absolutely an idea that the National Park Service could handle the work. They weren't well equipped enough to handle that work. And it's wild how much, I use the word intellectual capital, political capital, it's wild how much design capital, like they're bringing to the Park Service. So I would be interested to knowing that too. This is absolutely the beginning of a research project, certainly not the middle nor the ends, but I would hope that I would be able to answer that question more fully. I would imagine that they thought that the National Park Service needed help because it did. serious help.
Okay, I have a question, if I might. I noticed in the list of recommended sites, either by the ABC for the NHL designations or even the DeForest brothers, most of them looked like they fell into the category of, really commonly accepted and traditional sites like houses, homes. I didn't see too many dark sites of negative history. Is that just a product of preservation's pendulum shift today, which we think of those more commonly now? Were they present in the past?
So it's funny that you say that because it's true. There were a lot of homes of great Black Americans. There were even homes that were not extant. The W.E.B. Du Bois childhood home in Massachusetts was one that they recommended and was accepted to the National Historic Landmarks program. The home is no longer extant. And that was highly controversial because they're like, there's no degree of integrity. This is what the Park Service is saying. But the Forest brothers are saying this is a site that has the most significant association with Du Bois. It's the site where he grew up. And there's still actual plans to do something with the site today in 2021. Folks are thinking about what they're going to do with it. But so there were sites that I wouldn't say they commemorated dark history. I think they're specifically related to Black contributions in American history, lesser known histories. But there were also sites that didn't exist anymore. So even they proposed the DuSable, like the spot where DuSable founded Chicago. And it now it's just like a regular plaza on the side of the river. But they were intent on seeing the things that you couldn't see or making them seen, right? So in that instance, those are two examples of why the folks of the National Park Service were like, oh my gosh, we lowered our standards because there were no buildings there. And they put forth that argument. We're like, well, of course there's no buildings here. Consider what has happened over the course of the last 30, 40 years. So dark sites I haven't found. But there were nominations to folks like Denmark Vesey, who it ended up actually being a home that wasn't the home where he lived in. So that was another kind of situation that it's still in the National Historic Landmark Program. But there are homes, but there are nominations to folks who have done things that have been considered controversial in the United States history, the Stono Slave Rebellion, and Denmark Vesey in particular, commemorating these folks who would not have been recognized as contributing to American history when they're doing rebellions, and specifically slave rebellions, and leading these kinds of uprisings, I should say. But oh man, dark history, no.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Doug. Reconstruction, is it better than nothing at all as long as it doesn't become Disney-like? That's that. You got an hour for that?
So I'm like, well, you know, I think, like I said, since I work with Monument Lab, I'm like, they're doing work that pushes the boundaries of what we consider commemoration. So I'm gonna say this, I like the idea of Reconstruction for what it holds symbolically in American history, right? Reconstruction after the Civil War. And so now we're thinking about Reconstruction as it relates to buildings. I would support the notion of Reconstruction as it meant during the Civil War or after the Civil War, in terms of like human, you know, the possibilities in your life and the freedoms that you receive, you know, so like, or the freedoms that you fought for. So I like to think of Reconstruction a more abstract notion than that, but what it would mean for Reconstruction on the level of what we think about when we think about American history. What would that look like? That's what I'd be interested in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I guess, I think Frank had said something about reparations before, and I'm like, if yeah.
It's good word. Okay, I'm not sure about the next question, and I'll just read it, and perhaps the Sarah Sarah, you forwarded it. Looks like it's from Francesca. Good. Okay. I'd like to ask a question about your proposed survey of the NHL nominated sites and how they fared, if listed or not.
Okay. Sorry, could I just ask it? If that's okay. Thanks so much, Amber. I'm on the faculty here at Penn, and this is a great talk. Your research is so important, and I was curious about the follow-up that you've proposed about looking at what happened to these sites that were listed or not. And number one, it sounds like a lot of work, and I wonder how you're proposing to do that, because you know it's interesting. You know, you can't isolate, of course, whether the listing caused what happened or not, and it's going to require so much place-specific investigation, as you know, right? So I'm curious about how you're thinking about doing that, but then also just what your hunches are based on how you know, NHL listing has affected properties more broadly, and what you've seen of the list that you've compiled. What are your hunches about, you know, that question that you're going to pursue?
Well, it seems like, and this is not always the case. I appreciate that question. Well, yeah, what is a huge task? And I'm happy to report that I'm going on my sabbatical next academic year, so I'm very much looking forward to that. This is something that I hope to begin in the process of having that time off. The problem with that, I gave y'all Google Maps. It's like we can't really travel like that, so we'll see what happens. I was, you know, trying to do the Google Street View just to see, since I'm not going to these places. But from what I've seen, and this is not true across the board, but the sites going into public hands has been helpful to some degree in terms of a traditional preservation of the site, right? So national park, the ones that were turned into National Park Service units in particular, like the Woodson house that now under an extensive renovation ahead of opening it up as a museum, the Frederick Douglass home, those places, and even the Booker T. Washington, no, scratch that, the George Washington Carver home, like those, because they were promoted to the position as a National Park Service unit, like those have had millions of dollars thrown at them. No one's living there, but they're serving an educational purpose. Some of those that are in public hands, like the Mary Church Terrell House, have suffered from a lack of funding on the side of the folks who own the building, right? So it's major restoration that needs to happen, and it hopefully is going to happen. I've heard that Howard University has some major plans for this home, but funding is always and continues to be an issue. And so the ones that are able to be a part of the magical Park Service unit, you know, the Park Service system, I should say, those are the ones that have fared better than some of the ones I've looked at. I love the fact that they actually they did succeed in nominating things that were like apartments in an apartment building. Like there were several of those in Harlem. And that is tricky because there wasn't much in the way of like, how do you preserve this one apartment in a whole building? And so those are, you know, continuously in use. And I think that their units range from an apartment unit to a vast complex of hundreds of acres. And there's really no kind of set script on how to handle those. So public hands versus private hands is an issue. I would never recommend that a National Historic Landmark, in order to, you know, secure its survival, it should go into public hands, specifically if people are living and loving living in those places. I think that it's going to be an issue that has always been an issue in terms of finances and capital, and whether or not even the cities in which these places are located care about their existence. And that hasn't always been the case. That has absolutely not been the case. And so you see, you know, a kind of neglect of some of these sites that have to have folks rallying around them. The cemeteries in DC, for instance, were some that folks had to rally around just in the last 5 years to make sure that they remained untouched by development's hand. And so that's, I mean, these are some of the major issues that we have with some of these sites. I won't say that landmarking guaranteed, you know, their perpetuation in a way that will continue for them to be extant in the future. I think that preservation guaranteed their documentation to the extent where the National Park Service does it, which is, you know, through HABs and other things. One portion of ABC's and later the Afro-American Institute's work included collaboration with HUD. And so while I haven't been able to dig into what exactly they were doing, I know that, for instance, in Boley, Oklahoma, they were trying to use HUD grants to do some revitalization that way. So they're, you know, trying to see which portions of the federal government will actually work to help sustain these communities. And that is pretty awesome. There was a lot of proposals to do work with HUD in Boley. So that's another line of that work.
Okay, question from Ali. I was wondering if you have thoughts on the L'Enfant Trusts or other similar organizations' rehab work in DC, and particularly in the Anacostia neighborhood. Are there community revitalization efforts successful, or is the work resulting in greater gentrification and displacement?
So I don't really focus on Anacostia that much. I don't know if she hopped off the call. I know Sarah Schoenfeld and we did work on the Berry Farm nomination, local historic nomination in DC, but I have not followed exactly what's happening in Anacostia. Unfortunately, I this sounds bad. I do have a Northwest centered focus in most of my research, specifically around Howard and Shaw, but that's also where my family lived, which is why I was looking into those areas.
Okay, a question from Jean. Could you comment on the quality of the NHL nominations for Black properties prepared in 1976? I used the nomination for Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, but it was sparse in its history. Concluded it was done in haste for the bicentennial. Were they all that way?
So work that I did on the Carter G. Woodson house, I think that nomination was about maybe 10 pages long initially. I will say that a lot of the early nominations are sparse, and that's not ABC, that's like across the board with the National Park Service. I've seen, when I was sitting on the National Historic Landmarks Committee, I mean, I saw a nomination for the Virginia State Capitol that shocked me. I was like, this is all they have in here? Like truly, and that was from the 60s. And so what we've seen, or what I've seen, is that that's par for the course for a lot of those early nominations. Like the things that passed in the 60s and 70s would not pass today. So the work that we did, and this is actually something that almost anybody can do, is to update this nomination. The Park Service is open to that. And the reason even why that I looked at the Virginia State Capitol nomination is because its boundaries were being, the boundaries were being expanded. Oh no, they were renaming it. They were renaming it because its official name in the record was the capital of the Confederacy. Never mind that it was only that for like 4 years, of like the long history. And so like that's a job that continuously has to be done in terms of updating these nominations. And it can be done. The Park Service is offering grants to do this kind of work. So that's something that folks can take on, for instance, in your classes in school. That's an opportunity there.
Okay, a few more, and then I think we'll call it a night. Do you sense, sorry, from Janet, do you sense that the emphasis on integrity will officially change, and how it might change to bring about equal regard for Black sites?
So Janet, I appreciate that question. Hey, how you doing? Hey. And I see folks in the comments. Barbara was talking about the work that the ABC was bringing to Osawa, like they needed that. So the funny thing about integrity is that there's 7 degrees of it. There's 7 degrees of integrity for sites. And the ones that are often privileged have to do with workmanship and design. Never mind that all sites are not nominated for workmanship or design. So there are these kind of gray, fuzzy areas, as folks might call them, about feeling and sense of place, geography even. And folks don't like to touch those aspects of integrity. And that, I think, it goes right back into this notion that that Vincent DeForest said, the aesthetic biases of Anglo-American architectural historians who view these remains. Like, he's calling it out in the 70s. It's still the same case in 2021. And so when people talk about integrity, they're like, oh, we're lowering our standards if we, include some of these less than, fantastic architectural pieces or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that integrity has 7 aspects for a reason. And folks generally don't use all 7 because they don't want to have to deal with, okay, what if we do nominate this site and it has a strong sense of feeling or a strong sense of place or a strong association? They're like, how do we measure that? And I think the Berry Farm case was a spectacular case because the measurement of feeling and association with that site was provided by the folks who came and testified at the Historic Preservation Review Board. So people like to shy away from these notions of feeling and association because they don't want to have to deal with it. And they're like, we don't have standard units of measurement for this, right? There's no Secretary of Interior standards for feeling and association. But that doesn't mean that we're lowering the standards. It's that we haven't been using all of these aspects in the ways that they could be used, because we generally do have architectural historians who are filling out these nominations, not necessarily social historians or even landscape architects. Don't let a landscape architect come in and do a National Historic Landmark nomination because it's going to speak and read very, very differently from what we've been used to, right? So I think that it's really thinking about the limited ways in which we deal with integrity. And if we do want to talk about the vastness of how we can identify that, then it will open up the opportunity to have more diverse places beyond what we're used to seeing. Like, I think it's really important.
Amen to that. I couldn't agree more. Okay, last question, I think, for the night. You've been so generous with your answers. I feel like you're giving another lecture. We want to save you for the next time. from Sarah, and I think it's a good one to end on. Other than you, is there much overlap between people who are addressing the role of race in preservation and those who are doing the actual work of submitting nominations? We saved the hardest for last.
So there's one thing. Will you know one of those people, Sarah? I would say Nikita Reed. Oh, who is speaking at Penn in a few weeks, maybe next month. Is someone who I would say is working. She's definitely more on the practice side than the historiography side. I think that the work of, okay, thank you, April 6th, Nikita Reed. We went to UVA together. See, there's all kinds of connections. So I think that the work of Andrea Roberts, folks mention Andrea often in these kinds of circles is really important. Tara Dudley, Fallon, Samuels, Adu. Like I can like once I start going, I can go. And so there are a lot of folks who are working on the academic side of the research and scholarship side, and also working on the praxis side. A lot of the historians, the scholars I know aren't just doing one or the other. And what I mean by that is a lot of the Black American scholars I know aren't doing one or the other. They're often doing both. Obviously, I'm trying to get back to that question, so I make sure I'm answering it right. Yeah, I mean, the folks like Brent Leggs was on the call. I don't know if he's still on here. And I know Monica Rhodes is now a part of the Center for Civil Rights site. So like, these are folks who are addressing the role of race in preservation, but I'm not sure how much like those two in particular are submitting nominations. They're doing a lot in terms of advocacy and funding and things of that nature. But I think that there is a difference in folks who submit the nominations and those who are actually trying to pull together this larger history of African Americans working in historic preservation. Frank, I'm going to hop in and answer just one last question.
Yes.
That was from Maria. ABC turned into the Afro-American Institute for Historic Preservation and Community Development. That was the full official name. And they were active from the late 70s to 1989, I believe was the last date where they were doing contract work with the National Park Service. Are there any other organizations that are doing similar work? I mean, I would say Osawa is still doing that work. They've been there from the beginning, and they're absolutely, working with the Park Service. That's how I got involved, right? They brought me in, Maria and myself in to do that work. Yeah. And I think that it's important when preservations are like, well, we don't have subject matter experts. We don't know who could go to the Black organizations, the Black scholarly organizations, because they're going to have the John Blessing Games and the Mary Frances Berries. And they're going to have the folks who can give you that contextual information. And one thing I will say in regards to that too, that I feel very strongly about is this issue of funding and doing the research. Okay, yeah, Barbara said NPS recently signed a master cooperative agreement with Osawa, and we're working very closely with NPS. I think that it's important to bring the funds to those organizations too. So usually it's like the NPS or some other organization has the funds, they get the grants, they get the money, and then they bring in the Black folks. The Black folks organizations need the funds, and then y'all can come to them. Like that's really, because they are the folks who are going to know that history that's lacking here. And so I've had a lot of conversations with folks, especially recently, about funding and pushing forward these projects. And I really think it's important that folks look to the experts in this history and make really meaningful partnerships with them.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. The comments testify what a fantastic talk and how much everyone enjoyed this. On behalf of Weitzman School of Design and the program, Amber, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough. Sarah has put the link in for Nikita Reed's talk. So check that out. And with that, Amber, we wish you a really productive and healthy sabbatical next year, and we wait for the book.
So I'm gonna thank you, Frank, and I'll say one last thing, that I really appreciate the folks who come out, and I appreciate if you check in the link, there's a Black and Historic Preservation website that was recently launched that intends to be a full kind of directory of Black historic preservationists. So that's something that's super exciting. And I think it's something we could all look forward to.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Good night, be well, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, y'all.
And Micah has asked me to announce to the students that this site will be left open for 30 minutes if you want to have a conversation.
I'll be here.
Good night, all.